The Markup will come to order. I will remind everybody to please wear masks or you will not be recognized. The pending question is the amendment in nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377. Are there other amendments? For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Can I reserve a point of order?
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377, offered by Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. Page 12, line 4, strike and. Page 12, line 14, strike the period and insert and.
The amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman will explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this bill is a red flag law that infringes on the Second Amendment rights of Americans without due process. Under this bill, the Second Amendment can essentially be cast aside with little proof. Further, this bill only goes after the gun and does nothing to help or restrain an otherwise unstable individual. I've yet to see a red flag law that does not infringe on Second Amendment rights. But if the majority insists on pushing forward, we should do what we can to protect innocent people from discrimination simply because the current administration disagrees that people should have certain constitutional rights. My amendment would ensure the First Amendment activities, particularly parents voicing concerns about school board decisions, is not considered a risk factor under this bill. We have already seen the Biden administration attempt to cow parents from speaking out against curriculum pushing critical race theory. I recently joined many of my colleagues on the committee in sending a letter to Attorney General Garland, calling on him to rescind his recent memorandum targeting concerned parents at school board meetings for federal prosecution. At our hearing last week, the Attorney General acknowledged that he issued the memorandum soon after reading about the thinly sourced letter sent by the National School Boards Association to President Biden, in which these concerned parents were compared to domestic terrorists. Parents have an undisputed right to direct the upbringing and education of their children, especially as school boards attempt to install controversial curricula. Local law enforcement, and not the FBI, are the appropriate authorities to address any local threats of violence. The NSBA later expressed regret about the formally apologized for its letter to President Biden. It's critical that we protect both the First and Second Amendment rights of our constituents. This amendment would make it clear that parents can exercise their First Amendment rights without fear of unjustly having their Second Amendment rights taken away without due process. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to preserve our foundational rights, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
First of all, is the point of order insisted upon?
No, I withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is reserved. I'm sorry, the point of order is withdrawn.
I was just asking the gentleman if he would yield to a question, but if he won't, I'd seek time in opposition.
No, I don't yield, Mr. Chair. Go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd move
You
to...
yield back?
I yield back.
So the gentleman yield back. For what purpose does Mr. Cicilline seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment for a very simple reason. Of course, all First Amendment activity is protected. And in fact, to suggest by this amendment that only parents voicing concerns about school board decisions, that alone deserves special protection and other important First Amendment protections are not likewise protected, seems to me to be a very dangerous precedent. The First Amendment's in the Constitution. Nothing in this legislation would limit the exercise of the First Amendment in any way. And other than this fanciful obsession with school boards, and this apparently is like, we've heard about it now for a week. This seems to be a deep, deep obsession of my Republican friends. But there's lots of First Amendment concerns that are important to respect. And if we just list one, are we implicitly saying all the other areas of First Amendment expression, freedom of religion, opinions in a variety of other venues are not as important. So I think it's dangerous to carve out one, which is apparently the concern of the day, and suggesting in some way that is entitled to more First Amendment protection than many other expressions that are protected by the First Amendment. So again, this is another effort to create an issue where one doesn't exist, to offer an amendment that is not necessary and adds nothing to the bill, but gives my good friends on the other side of the aisle, an opportunity to talk about something which I think, again, they've completely misconstrued. I think the Attorney General made it very, very clear that he absolutely understands First Amendment rights of people to express opinions at school boards, and parents even expressing those opinions in passionate ways are, of course, protected by the First Amendment, and that his jurisdiction is limited to threats of violence or serious bodily harm.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't. Actually, I'm not done. He said that multiple times during the hearing. He's not here today to repeat it for maybe the 15th or 16th or 17th time. And so my friends on the other side of the aisle keep mischaracterizing what he said. So I'm going to say it one more time. The Attorney General of the United States said under oath that the First Amendment, of course, is respected by everyone, that parents have a right to go to school board meetings and say whatever they want as passionately as they want. And the Attorney General's role and the FBI's role is to protect people who present a danger of violence, serious bodily injury, which, by the way, is being reported in school boards and schools and against educators and administrators, unfortunately, in places all across this country. And the notion that the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States has no role in protecting people who serve as teachers and school administrators and on school boards, has no responsibility to protect them from serious threats of violence or serious bodily harms, is absurd. That's exactly their job. And so it's an interesting discussion point. It gives you an opportunity to mischaracterize what the Attorney General said. Again, it's unnecessary. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Then why did they apologize? If it's all wonderful, why did they write this letter 24 hours after the Attorney General testified in front of this committee? Paragraph number 2, we regret and apologize for the letter. Same paragraph, we apologize for the strain and stress. Why'd they do that? We haven't mischaracterized one single thing. Mischaracterized the Attorney General. Are you kidding me? The Attorney General just said a few hours ago in the Senate Judiciary Committee that he will not rescind the memo that does this, that sets up a dedicated line of communication for threat reporting, a snitch line on parents. He will not rescind that. Even though the only basis, as he testified to last week, the only basis for the memorandum was what? The school board letter to the president, the same school board letter that that same association has now apologized for. Oh, here's what else we found out from the Senate hearing just a few hours ago. Here's a letter from one of these U.S. attorneys in the state of Montana, one of the 94 U.S. attorney districts, where the Attorney General said, you got to set up a task force in this, you got to convene a meeting within 30 days. Here's what this letter said. The FBI, the United States Attorney's Office, will then collaborate with any interested parties to determine if a federal investigation and prosecution should commence. Who the heck are interested parties? We don't know who that is. Is it the National School Board Association? And the Democrats want to say we've mischaracterized. I'll tell you who's mischaracterized it. Last week, Democrats agreed with the National School Board Association. Here's what Mr. Raskin said. He said, the dark impulses giving rise to conspiracy-driven mob violence, not just in state capitals, but also in schools and school boards. That's just not true. Because if it was, I don't think the School Board Association would apologize. I don't think they would. Certainly not 24 hours after we had a hearing. This is serious stuff. And the fact that the Attorney General of the United States insists on not rescinding his memo makes absolutely no sense to me. But more importantly, I think it makes no sense to all kinds of parents, all kinds of moms and dads around this country who know, everyone sees what this was about. This was political. This was to chill First Amendment activity of moms and dads. And that's why the gentleman from Wisconsin's amendment is so right on target. And I'd be happy to yield to him if he has something to add to the gentleman from Rhode Island's ridiculous comments.
Mr. Chair, I think it's worth flagging because in this particular case, there was a chilling effect. which is, I think, what everyone is concerned about. I mean, any time that somebody in the White House doesn't agree with what's being discussed or what's happening out on the street, I mean, if it's easy enough to just call the Attorney General and say, you know, is there any way you could quickly draft up a memo on this, the chilling effect that that'll have across this nation, I mean, that's what the big concern should be. And I would yield to the gentleman from North Carolina. To North Carolina.
So here's why it's necessary to single out the activity of moms and dads advocating before their school boards. It is because the Attorney General has singled them out. And the Attorney General acknowledged to us in his hearing that the predicate for that was this letter from the National School Boards Association. And that is the letter that the National School Boards Association has now apologized for. The Attorney General should never have acted on the predicate of that alone without doing an independent investigation to issue a memorandum to nationwide law enforcement. And once the predicate, even that predicate has been exploded, he should have the decency and the responsibility to withdraw that guidance, but he has not. And indeed, in the same letter that Mr. Jordan referred to, the letter from the Montana Attorney General, or the Montana U.S. Attorney, it starts off, in response to a nationwide rise in threats and acts of violence against our educational community. There is no evidence of such a nationwide rise. There are isolated reports of someone doing some minor slapping somebody or something. There have been a couple of those arrests. There have been a couple of actually misreported threats. I read every source in the National School Boards Association letter. There is no nationwide rise in threats. And anyone who continues on this committee to repeat that rhetoric should come forward with your evidence. Let's see your numbers. Let's hear your details. Let's understand where the prosecution stands. They do not exist. And in the absence of that, and I got to tell you, members of this committee receive threats from time to time. We don't send out nationwide memos from the Justice Department calling people out.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I'd ask
For
you
what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter in response to Attorney General Garland's memorandum, the letter from the acting United States Attorney for the district in Montana.
Without objection, I will now recognize myself to strike the last word, and I will speak in opposition to the amendment. First of all, I don't care about the National School Board Association's letter or not, or whether they knew what they were talking about or not. There is ample evidence all across the country of a great rise in threats against school board members. You just have to watch the news every night and you see threats against school board members. And so it is amply justified for the Attorney General to instruct the FBI or whoever to initiate investigations to protect members of school boards, period. But in any event, this has nothing to do with this bill. This bill does not deal with school boards. This bill deals with temporary orders of protection against firearms by people who pose a threat to themselves or others. And that's what we ought to be discussing, forgetting the school boards. This bill has nothing to do with school boards. And the bill simply sets up that when someone is a threat to someone else, when there's an imminent danger of that person using firearms to injure that person, you have 14 days. You can get an ex parte order within 72 hours. You can get an ex parte order lasting no more than 14 days to show on probable cause. And if you want to extend that, you've got to show clear and convincing evidence. And none of this has anything to do with a violation of the First Amendment. It's totally irrelevant. It's to the bill, and I therefore oppose it, and I yield back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Issa seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, you know, one of the things that I observed in looking at this committee over 2 decades is that often both sides get so heated that we lose track that an amendment quite frankly, is going to have no negative or dilatory effect on the bill, even if it offends the other side. And so I would defend that you should be perfectly willing to support this amendment, because nothing in it would unreasonably deter someone from executing this bill. It would certainly not cause any Democrat to not vote for it. And at the end of the day, a statement that may not consider activities protected under the First Amendment doesn't sound all that bad if you stop thinking, oh, we don't get along, Republicans and Democrats. I've been here for a long time. I'm best known for investigations. And what I've found in investigations is that when someone says there isn't something there and wants to shut down an investigation, they do so often out of fear that there's a lot more there than not. And I would say that when it comes to questioning whether or not the Department of Justice is having a chilling effect on First Amendment freedom of speech, whether it's school boards or anywhere else, we should all be willing to say, we don't know it. In just a moment. We don't know that there isn't a there, or there is a there, but we ought to all be willing to go down that road, even if at the end of the day, it's a dead end. I remember the IRS situation, one in which there was no there, but at the end of the day, the person who conspired to do it resigned or retired and took the fifth. So I think all of us would be better off allowing the process to go forward and to protect the First Amendment, and I'd yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I was just intrigued by your comment that when someone says an investigation is not necessary, it usually is necessary. I've heard every single member from your side of the aisle, other than yourself so far, talk about how an investigation of the violence against school boards is not necessary. And your logic would lead us to say, well, that means that it is necessary. And I concur with that. It is necessary.
Reclaiming and hopefully properly using my time, I respect the U.S. Attorney's right to do investigations. I don't respect their right to put out a broad spectrum of a letter like this that would have a clear chilling effect on parents simply going and doing what they have done for generations at school boards, often heated, often frustrated. And that's even in the best of schools and perhaps the most benign of parents. You give a parent a feeling that their child isn't getting the proper education, and a lamb becomes a lion. Having said that, it is how it was done that offends me, not the fact that the Department of Justice could, on individual and isolated basis, be looking for violence. What I would say, though, is that the Department of Justice today has plenty of violence to look at without having to look for the threat of violence, and I think there's a real point there. But I thank the gentleman for pointing out that sometimes when, in fact, there isn't, there is. Maybe there is some, no question at all. But you don't have to send out a letter to 94 U.S. attorneys. You don't have to intimidate every parent and put them in fear because somebody gets overheated or takes a swing in a public meeting, whether it's a school board or, in fact, a city council meeting or any other sort of place. Those things do happen. For the most part, they are not and should not be federal offenses. They are, in fact, local issues. And I would hope that the U.S. attorneys would be working on those issues for which a district attorney is unable to investigate or prosecute. And I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I just have to absolutely say that I'm urging my colleagues not to support this amendment. It is a partisan attack, and it's meant to distract us from the essence of what this legislation really means. So let's get back to talking about what this legislation really is meant to do. And I'd like to refer to earlier what Congressman Fitzgerald said, that this bill was written by the Biden administration. And this could absolutely not be further from the truth. This bill was originally drafted through a bipartisan collaboration between Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal. And it is based off what we have learned from the successful bipartisan efforts of the many states that have passed similar laws at the state level. Many Republicans have actually supported extreme risk protection laws. In 2019, after the terrible back-to-back shooting in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, President Trump said, and I quote, "We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms. And if they do, those firearms can be taken through the rapid due process," end quote. That was President Trump. Senator Ted Cruz said extreme risk laws are, and I'm quoting once again, "a law enforcement tool that can be helpful in preventing crimes of violence," end quote. This is not about politics. These laws protect the Second Amendment rights of responsible gun owners by targeting only those that are presenting a risk to themselves or to others. This is not about politics. This is about saving lives. So let's get back to the essence of what we need to be debating and stop all of this frivolous rhetoric about everything else that we want to talk about. We're here to talk about saving lives. Let's do that today, because you have constituents in your own demographics that need the protection of this bill. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman, the gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chair. I would note that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to dismiss the concerns that we are putting forth about what's happened with respect to targeting school boards. I understand why they want to do that, because they certainly don't want to talk about school boards, because the American people are waking up to the blatant attack on the rights of parents going on currently in schools across the country. There are signs dotting Northern Virginia right now, right? Because there are races going on. There's a sign I drove by this morning. It says, "Keep parents out of classrooms." Keep parents out of classrooms. That's the story. Mm-hmm. And that's the story that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not want to address. Because they know full well the American people are absolutely sick and tired of having politicians get in and start teaching their kids that America is evil and go into the classroom and go into the school boards and take over the schools and hide it from parents. But the one upside of this disastrous virus is that the veil has been lifted on a corrupt school system that has been undermining our American children for generations. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle know it. The campaigns going on in Virginia and New Jersey, the campaigns know it, and they're running away from it, and they're seeing the disaster that has unfolded with the Attorney General of the United States targeting a father defending his little girl who was raped in a bathroom. That's the truth. That's the reality. And we're bringing it up here in the context of a bill, another bill by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, targeting Americans, targeting our Second Amendment rights and our ability to defend ourselves against tyranny. And then my colleagues say, well, why do we need to talk about that here? Well, you tell me. You tell me whether I should trust the Department of Justice not to go after Scott Smith and to go after Scott Smith and take away any firearms he might have.
Yeah, good point.
You tell me whether Scott Smith wouldn't be Exhibit A of the kind of citizen in this country who would be targeted by an attorney general that's now got his U.S. Attorney's Office putting out 13 crimes to go after parents and to go after and target people in school boards, when Mr. Smith was bloodied and arrested in a school board meeting for simply going forward and trying to defend his daughter after the very school board in question lied, and covered up a rape of his daughter on May 28th in a bathroom in a high school when she's in the 9th grade in Loudoun County, Virginia. They covered it up, they hid it, and then what happened just a few weeks ago at Broad Run High School, just a few miles down the road, but another young girl was assaulted by the same boy. That's what occurred. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about that. What they want to talk about is using the power of government. Using the power of government to walk into people's houses and take away their ability to defend themselves. And they want to hide behind, oh, we're going to provide due process. But don't mind the fact that that due process occurs, supposed due process, fake due process, that occurs after their rights have been stripped away, after the power of government has come into their homes and taken away their firearms. That's the actual truth. I listen to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking about, oh, well, we have a right to be free from fear. We have a right to be free from violence. No, there is a duty in the Constitution for us to secure the blessings of liberty. We have a duty in government to protect the citizenry. One way to do that, by the way, is not to defund the police. One way to do that is to actually stand behind law enforcement so that we can have secure communities, as our constituents expect us to do. One way to do that is to ensure that the citizens are in fact able to arm themselves and defend themselves when government abandons them. Abandons them just as they are right now on the southern border of the United States, where cartels have operational control of our border, where people are pouring into Texas. Fentanyl is pouring into Texas. Danger on our streets. People dying from fentanyl overdoses. And then we have people dying across this country because we have gangs and violence increasing and murder rates skyrocketing. Why? What would the correlation be? Is it because we need to have some sort of red flag law to go after an American citizen's rights to defend themselves? Or could it be that we've abandoned any concept of what justice should actually look like in this country, where we can actually have security in our streets rather than pulling cops off the streets as they did in Austin, Texas, and we watched the murder rate skyrocket? There is a correlation here. We are talking about rights, and we know full well that the same people that would go after our gun rights would target Scott Smith because he dared to speak up at a school board in Loudoun County, Virginia. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word and to discuss the underlying
recognized.
bill. I thank the chairman very much. I want to thank Congressman McBath again, because really you would, really at this moment, with as much has been thrown at you, give you accolades for your courage. You did not have to lead on this legislation. We've known from the time that you've started on the Judiciary Committee that you have a personal hurt that will never go away. And many times that hurt is kept to that person's self, and they do not put themselves out to do what is right and good for the American people. I'm grateful that you have done that, and I'm grateful that you have spoken about guns. Now, someone might begin to say, oh, don't read the Second Amendment, because as we all know, it has been manipulated and utilized and expanded over the centuries. But I am compelled to read Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Tied, of course, to the security of a nation. It has become many things to many people. But one thing that Florida and Indiana know, Republican-led states, that red flag laws work. And to associate a rightful letter by the DOJ to ensure the safety and security of parents, school board members, children in the discourse of education, and to tie it into a life-saving tool that has been used by 19 states is ludicrous. I will rush to the aid of that dad who is seeking information. As a parent, I have stood before school boards, not only for my children, but I've stood before it for throngs of children. I have never raised my hand to slap a parent. I've never tried to slap a school board member. I've never tried to struggle with a gun. And it has been some heated meetings, and I'm from Texas. We've had some discussions. When you speak about the children you love, you are passionate. I don't think the Attorney General in any way disregards that passion. Whoever put that sign up, God bless him, I'll take it down. Because I don't know who would stop rightful parents from being in a school board meeting. As far as I know, if a school board allows a public session and opens it up for individuals who signed up to speak. They're the closest thing, even beyond city councils, for that town hall style meeting. My superintendent is out in the community, letting parents speak at schools in off hours. This bill deals with saving lives. It has an ex parte provision. There are requirements, 14 days. And then if you want it longer, 180 days, you have an indicia of criteria that you must present. It is not taken lightly. And next go round, I'll acknowledge that. But I want to add this into the record, Mr. Chairman, and read these words. It is Tips's warning to FBI and Florida shooting suspect. I know he's going to explode, and forgive me for those who have a sensitivity to Parkland. I do, but I'm not from Florida. But allow me to read this. I know he's going to explode. A woman who knew Mr. Cruz said on the FBI tip line on January 5th. Her big worry was that he might resort to slipping into a school and just shooting the place up. 40 days later, Mr. Cruz accused of doing just that, barging into his former high school in Parkland, Florida, and shooting 17 people to death. 3 months before the February 14th massacre of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, a family friend dialed 911 to tell the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office about Mr. Cruz's personal arsenal. I need someone here because I'm afraid he comes back and he has a lot of weapons. Red flag laws. Not denying him his due process, but from a dangerous potential person who had guns. How many lives could be saved? And so I believe we should support this bill enthusiastically. It is constitutionally grounded, and it has nothing to do with the DOJ's responsibility to teachers, parents, and school board members for their safety and security and their children. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
To speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by returning to the letter that Mr. Jordan cited, where the acting U.S. attorney in Montana notifies everybody, all county attorneys, sheriffs, the Office of Public Instruction, the School Boards Association, the FBI, quote, the FBI and the United States Attorney will then collaborate with any interested parties to determine if a federal investigation and prosecution should commence. Investigation and prosecution over what? Well, he helpfully lists a number of things: anonymous telecommunications harassment, making repeated calls to your school board member, repeated harassing communication, all grounds for prosecution. And the assurance we hear is, well, if parents attend a school board meeting and don't get out of line, they've got nothing to fear. Well, Professor Jonathan Turley pointed out that's about as reassuring as saying you're going to be followed everywhere you go by a patrol car, but you've got nothing to fear. Are you going to drive more or less under those circumstances? The fear expressed to me by a number of parents is, well, what happens if I attend a school board meeting and some yahoo makes a veiled threat or a fight breaks out on the other side of the room, and suddenly everyone who came to that meeting gets a visit from the FBI? That's chilling. And its obvious purpose is to add enough risk, enough fear, to convince enough parents not to assert their right to petition their government for a redress of grievances, one of the most fundamental rights of a free people. Now comes before us a bill that says, well, your firearms can be seized in a secret proceeding that you don't even know has happened until it's over, because somebody thinks you might pose a danger, but they can't prove it. The question arises, would it be enough? Would it be probable cause to say, well, this person is under investigation by the FBI because they attended a meeting and they were seen cheering someone who said, we're coming after you in the next election, which was interpreted as a threat by a school board member. Now, in days past, such fears would seem fanciful, if not preposterous. Unfortunately, these days, not so much. So I applaud this amendment. I think it illuminates the intent of the majority that are supporting both of these policies. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Big seek recognition?
Move strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I'll yield to my friend from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Roy from Texas in his analysis of this amendment and the current situation, with one exception. And I wanted to just ask Mr. Roy a quick question. But you mentioned that it was a boy, quote unquote, who attacked this young girl in Loudoun County. The left uses these phrases, and the media uses these phrases in ways that really tend to shift the focus away from their pet projects. But according to the left, when a boy puts a dress on and declares himself a girl, he is a transgender girl. When a boy puts a dress on and commits a crime, then he is a boy, because they don't want to admit that transgender girls, transgender women, shouldn't be in women's shelters. After a woman gets brutally beaten by a man and seeks refuge in a woman's shelter, the last thing she wants to see, in my experience in law enforcement, is another man. And so to make men to give men access to a woman's shelter because they dress like a woman is something the left is parading around and advocating for. They have to call what happened in Loudoun County a crime by a boy. Can't call it a transgender girl. I was just wondering if my friend from Texas had any thoughts about that. I appreciate the question from the gentleman from Colorado. Obviously, the facts in question that led to the situation where Mr. Smith was dealing with the circumstances in July before the Loudoun County School Board is that school board's obsession with woke politics involving transgenderism, transgender policies, and talking about how important it was for that school to embrace such policies, and therefore creating an environment in which this, I assume, biological boy was able to be in the girls' bathroom when this 9th grade girl was therefore then raped, sodomized in the bathroom of a high school that her parents sent her to be educated. Now, interestingly, it was in Broad Run High School a few weeks ago when the other young girl was assaulted by this, again, I believe, biological boy, and that the defense by the boy, biological boy, was that his skirt got caught on his watch, and therefore in something going on in the bathroom, he then therefore assaulted this girl. The second time. The second time. After he was then let free, of course. After he had been brought forward and charged, was let out. And the school board covered it up. This is the circumstances. This is the environment. This is the reason parents are so frustrated and angry. Which is it? Is this a boy or is this a girl? And then does it matter? And to your point, as a former U.S. attorney and someone who worked in law enforcement, as you did, right? When we're talking about shelters and protecting women, which is it? Is it a girl or is it a boy? And don't these things matter? Don't fundamental truths matter? And I yield back to the gentleman from Colorado.
And I yield to my friend from Arizona.
Thank you. So the chairman mentioned that there's been ample evidence of a rise in threats at the school board level, and rather mystically, like the Attorney General testified just last week, he couldn't produce any. Rather mystically, like the National School Board Association, they couldn't produce any evidence either. And we've been having trouble in my office finding that evidence. Well, so on page 11 of the bill, when you start looking at the factors, and you start coupling the factors that are going to give someone basically a lack of due process, and remove their private property rights, and effectively punish them with some ex parte hearing, you add the AG's directive in there, which implies and imputes that parents going to school boards might qualify under line 14, page 11, factors to consider here. And you begin to see why this amendment not only is rational, it is necessary. The removal of one's property rights, the removal of one's given rights before one is given a hearing isn't
Time
due
of the
process
gentleman has
at all.
expired. Let me remind everyone, please wear your masks, and if you don't, you will not be recognized to speak. For what purpose does Mr. Massey seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
I don't think you're using your mic.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. I'd like to speak in favor of the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Does the gentleman from Arizona wish to have some more time to finish his last statement?
I will wait till you finish your statement,
Okay.
and then I'll proceed if it's possible.
Thank you. Well, here we are debating red flag laws. They're completely redundant because every state has laws to deal with people who are a danger to themselves or others. It's unconstitutional. It turns due process on its head. But I heard something earlier in the debate that I just can't let slide. One of our colleagues from Tennessee said he didn't know of a single instance where a good guy with a gun has stopped a bad guy with a gun. It's literally the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So I'm going to inform the gentleman from Tennessee, if he's still in the hearing, of several instances of good guys or women stopping bad guys with the gun. On May 15th of this year, an attacker at an apartment complex in Fort Smith, Arkansas, fatally shot a woman and then fired 93 rounds at other people before a man, a good guy, a man killed him with a bolt-action rifle. Police say he likely saved a number of lives in the process. This is a good guy with a gun stopping a bad guy with a gun. On June 30th, a 12-year-old Louisiana boy used a hunting rifle to stop an armed burglar who was threatening his mother's life during a home invasion. Well, that's a good boy with a gun stopping a bad guy with a gun. On July 4th, the Chicago gunman shot into a crowd of people, killing one and wounding two others before a concealed handgun permit holder shot and wounded the attacker. Police praised him for stepping in. Again, good guy stops bad guy. This is literally the only way to do it. In fact, don't take my word for it. Don't take the media's word for it. In fact, this year alone, over 1,000 reports in the media who are very reluctant to report these sorts of things gave stories in the media of good guys who stop bad guys with guns. The U.S. Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey indicates—
Would the gentleman yield?
Let me finish, please. That around 100,000 defensive gun uses occur each year. An estimate that, though it may seem like a lot, is actually much lower than 17 other surveys. The other surveys find that between 760,000 defensive handgun uses and 3.6 million defensive uses of any type of gun per year, with an average of about 2 million. This comes from an article that I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to submit to the record, entitled "There Are Far More Defensive Gun Uses Than Murders." Here's why you rarely hear of them. Dated September 22nd, 2021 by John R. Lott Jr. and printed in Real Clear Investigations. I ask unanimous consent to submit this article for the record.
Without objection.
And I will yield 30 seconds to my colleague from Tennessee.
Thank you very much. There are some instances indeed, and I said there were no instances in the country. I was certainly wrong, and I got too hyperbolic. There are not that many, though, and there have been none in
Mr.
Memphis.
Cohen,
And I
we're
don't believe
unable
there
to
have been thousands in the country.
Mr. Cohen, we have a technical problem and are unable
Tweets
to
and your
understand you.
response and the group that had it. I think that's overblown. But the bottom line is that's not the issue. Is when you have a red flag and save people's lives.
Reclaiming my time, and I hope somebody else will yield Mr. Cohen more time when his audio-visual problem is solved. You know, the reason you get differences between the 100,000 number that our own U.S. Department of Justice says is the number of defensive gun uses each year, and the million-plus number, is because the surveys the difference arises from the screening question. If the survey asks if somebody is a victim, if they first ask if the person has been a victim of a crime, only respondents who answer yes are asked if they have ever used a gun defensively. In other words, you don't consider yourself a victim, and so you don't complete the survey if you actually used the gun and prevented yourself from being a victim. So that's why the U.S. Department of Justice's number is so low. By low, I say 100,000. Even with the slanted survey, they confirm there are 100,000 defensive uses of guns every year. Other surveys show up to 3.6 million. And with that, if my document has been submitted to the record, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
George Johnson suggested he and I have dinner.
Is Mr. Raskin seeking recognition? You're muted. Does anyone seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very
Before he
much.
starts, would you yield briefly to me, please?
Yes, I yield to the chairman. Happily.
Thank you. I just wanted to wonder what Mr. Roy's extensive discussion of transvesticism has to do with this bill. I yield back. I yield back to Mr. Raskin.
Well, there have been many amazing and appalling things said today, but perhaps the most shocking one for me was the suggestion that the Second Amendment gives the citizens of the United States the right to raise arms against the government if we perceive tyranny taking place. And I wonder if my friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, would yield for a question, because what it made me think about was Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. There were a number of citizens who gathered around there. Did they have the right to use their weapons to kill Derek Chauvin at that point?
My friend from Maryland, is going to go through asking hypotheticals about these situations. My friend from, I can't remember.
That really happened.
One of my colleagues on this side of the aisle made the point that the purpose of this is to create the barrier to which the government knows that if the people have the ability to arm themselves, they can push back against tyranny. As I explained earlier about Black Americans
I'm just
who
trying
were
to
denied their ability, their God-given right to defend themselves.
I'm trying to concretize your point. There have been a number of cases of officers killing unarmed African-American suspects, and you raised this in the question of race and the right of African-Americans to defend themselves. And I just want to be clear what your position is the purpose of the Second Amendment to give people the right to use armed force against police officers in a situation like that. That's nothing hypothetical about it at all. Derek Chauvin has been convicted of murder. So I just want to know, could George Floyd or any other person observing that scene have used a weapon to kill Derek Chauvin in order to disarm that exercise of tyranny against a citizen?
Well, we could have a long discussion about this professorial style, as I'm sure you would enjoy, and so would I. But the reality is, the point of the Second Amendment is to make a very clear statement about who has the power in this country. That's the point. The laws exist on the books. And yes, there are examples where people have used firearms defensively to defend themselves, and including law enforcement personnel when power is being used the wrong way. And if there's a law enforcement officer raping a young woman and that woman pulls a gun and kills the law enforcement officer, she should. That's the point.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to be clear about that, because you're sending a very tough message to the public about the use of force against officers who may be abusing their authority. The Supreme Court in
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
Yes.
Mr. Roy answered the question when I asked, does he think that people may use armed force against American troops? And he said yes. He said yes. In defense of tyranny, you can use force against American troops, and everything else would follow. I yield back to
the gentleman.
Mr.
That is not That was not
But,
what I
but
said.
Mr. Roy, I'll yield to you in 1 second, but maybe you'll incorporate an answer to my question. The people who attacked us on January 6th, wounding and injuring more than 140 officers, as you know, breaking people's noses and jaws and vertebrae and arms and so on, and giving people heart attacks. Those people were claiming that they were opposing tyranny. They used exactly the language you did. They said this was 1776. Some of them said it was Civil War Part 2. Do you think that they were justified in taking up arms against the US Congress on that day?
I don't accept your characterization, but what I would say to you is to my
You
friend.
don't? Well,
do you
which
think-
part?
No, I
Which
don't.
part?
The idea that you're saying that that the way you characterize the events of January 6th, I don't accept your characterization of that. But what I would suggest.
Wait.
to you
Well, what
is
part
that-
do you not accept? You don't accept that there was violence and that we suffered more than 140 injuries on our police force defending our lives?
Of course, I understand that there was violence on January 6th, but what the gentleman from Maryland is suggesting is that somehow that's tied to the existence of a Second Amendment right and the ability of people to
No,
defend
I'm
themselves
asking
as
you,
they
you
need to
were
be able to
saying-
defend themselves. That's what you're trying to characterize and
Mr.
draw
Roy,
the
wait,
link.
I'm not
That's what
playing
you're
games
suggesting.
here. No, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking you this question, which is you were saying the purpose of the Second Amendment is to allow the people to defend themselves against tyranny. That's precisely the language being used by those who are defending the violent assault on Congress on January 6th. Were those people justified in
Time of the
taking up arms
gentleman
against?
has expired.
And he can answer. Can he answer that, Mr. Chairman?
I'll permit that.
The gentleman's time's expired, but in a minute, I'll be happy to continue to address.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to yield time to the gentleman from Colorado.
I just want to answer Mr. Raskin's question. No, you may not kill a police officer, ever, period, end of story. Okay, Mr. Raskin? Just want to make sure that is really offensive that you would suggest.
Oh, well, wait.
No, I didn't ask. I didn't yield time, Mr. Raskin. You know what the rules are. I didn't yield time. You can get time from one of your colleagues. But we have all watched what's happened in the socialist country that you folks are trying to make Venezuela, as they have taken the guns away from people and then empowered thugs to enforce their laws against innocent people. We have watched Venezuelans screaming across our border so that they can live in the land of the free. We have watched other countries that they have disarmed the public and then allowed the government to impose tyranny. And we will not stand for that tyranny in this country. And the government knows that we are a well-armed people that won't stand for it. Don't confuse that with killing a police officer. I yield back to my friend from Wisconsin.
Thank you very much. So I rise in support of the amendment here from the gentleman from Wisconsin. And let's be real clear here. You know, in reading this memo that came from the United States Attorney in Montana, it's very clear that this is meant to have, at a minimum, a chilling effect and possibly intimidation in saying to people, be careful going to these school board meetings if you're going to raise your voice, because it may be the feds coming for you. We're watching you. I asked in the hearing last week of the Attorney General, did any states ask for help? He did not answer the question. And we all know what the answer is when they do not answer the question. States did not ask for help. This was set up by the Biden administration to send a chilling message to parents. Hey, as the candidate for governor in Virginia has been saying, you parents don't have a role in your schools. The government will take care of how your schools are run. Now, I paraphrase a little bit there, but that's in effect what the Democrat governor for candidate from Virginia said. Hey, you parents, you don't have any role in your schools here. We will take care of it. And parents across the country have gotten the message. But you also think about all the stuff that has happened here over the past 10 months. And I think the culmination of it is the trillions and trillions of dollars that are going to be spent or proposed to be spent in these bills that are being contemplated right now. 87,000 new IRS agents. Think about it. 87,000 IRS agents. will anybody be safe? They are coming after your bank account. They don't want parents at school board meetings. The message is clear at this point. And that's why this amendment is so important. Gentleman from Texas, do you need any time?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Well, I appreciate that. And to be clear, I associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Colorado as someone who's, as many people on the other side of the aisle, whose families and people have served in law enforcement. My grandfather's a police officer. My great-great-grandfather was a Texas Ranger. I worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I very much respect and admire all of those who are working in law enforcement. And of course, the rule of law is what governs in our country. And to have the other side want to try to turn that on its head when what we're talking about here is the reality of the ability of the citizenry to be able to, and as the gentleman from Colorado rightfully noted, create that, essentially, if I'm going to use a term from First Amendment jurisprudence, the wall of separation, the ability to be able to prevent the growth of government, the tyranny of government when they know that their citizens are armed. That is just a simple reality of our founding and our history and who we are as a country. And it is a very profound recognition of what the reality was in 19th century America and the purposeful, specific de-arming of Black Americans, white Americans who stood alongside Black Americans, freed Black Americans, slave Black Americans who were being denied the ability to live free. It's historic, it's purposeful, and it was done. And the whole point here is that an armed citizenry is what holds that line for being able to ensure the government does not grow too powerful. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would just close with this, Mr. Chairman. The federal government is getting involved in a place that it doesn't have to. The gentleman from Kentucky has made this point a couple times. We have Chapter 51 in the state of Wisconsin that deals with an involuntary confinement. All states have this, but out of the issues that the states can handle better than the federal government. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Garcia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized, and you might want to speak closer to your mic.
Okay. Sorry, I was in the middle of two mics and I used the one on the right. I should have stayed away from the right. I just want to say that I strenuously am opposed to this amendment, and I want to repeat some of the words or paraphrase some of the words of the author of the bill. I mean, let's get back to focus. This is about red flag laws. The word school board, I don't think is anywhere in this bill. I don't think that we should even be talking about all this. It just seems to be such a deviation and a waste of time to continue some of this dialogue. But in the interest of making sure that we hear Mr. Raskin's response to some of the comments that were made, I know he was anxious to do so, but was not given time. I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Look, the Second Amendment, according to the Supreme Court in the Heller decision, protects all of our right to carry a gun in self-defense, and everyone's right to possess weapons for the purposes of hunting and recreation. It is also subject, according to Justice Scalia and the majority of the Supreme Court, to reasonable regulation in the interest of public safety, the overwhelming interest in public safety. So the suggestion that there's an additional right to use a weapon to protect yourself against what you perceive as tyranny is not based in any Supreme Court precedent. That is not based in anything that has been written by the Supreme Court. And of course, it's precisely what was invoked against us when there were people who came to storm the Capitol of the United States to interrupt our counting of electoral college votes and to wound and injure 140 of our officers, many of whom are still suffering the wounds from that day, both the physical wounds that were inflicted by a rampaging mob, and then also post-traumatic stress syndrome and all of the psychological and emotional effects of that. You want to talk about attacking police officers? That was a bunch of people attacking police officers, spouting all kinds of propaganda and nonsense about a stolen election, mimicking the claims of Donald Trump, despite the fact that more than 60 federal and state courts have rejected every claim of electoral fraud or electoral corruption. So you want to talk about factual relativism and moral relativism. Talk about Donald Trump and this movement that he has created to question the federal judiciary, to question the actions of Congress, to question election officials, like Republican election officials, like the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, all of whom reject these false claims. And yet now they come in citing their interest in stopping tyranny and 1776 and so on, and wage violence against our officers. So I'm just saying this rhetoric is getting very dangerous. And I'm glad that Mr. Buck intervened to restore some semblance of sanity to the discussion. People do not have a right in the United States of America just to take up arms against the government under the Second Amendment. And that is not what the Supreme Court has said. And at another point, I would love to engage in an historical exegesis about what the Second Amendment is really about, because its history is very much intertwined, as I think my colleague from Texas was beginning to intimate, with the history of slavery and the attempt to make sure that state militias could put down slave insurrections in the country. But I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentlelady yield?
No, reclaiming my time, I yield back to the chairman.
You won't yield.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I want to simply point out the logic that we heard from Mr. Roy, whether he realized it or not. He said one of the purposes of the Second Amendment is to enable Americans to defend liberty. And I said, does that mean they can shoot American troops? They can oppose American troops? He in effect said yes. And then when he said, well, if a woman is being raped, she can certainly shoot the police officer. Well, how about someone else shooting the police officer if he believes that the police officer is doing something wrong? That way lies anarchy. And I would also observe that none of this has anything to do with this bill or this amendment. And I yield back.
I've got 1 second, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. For what purpose does Mr. Gomer seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. With regard to the comment that Second Amendment was to help put down slave insurrections, what my friend was talking about earlier was actually at the beginning of the National Rifle Association that was created in part to ensure that Black Americans would have the right to keep and bear arms, because there were bigoted, biased people and rules, laws that were trying to prevent African Americans from having guns, and the effort was to make sure that they had them. Most people don't realize that's at the basis, the foundational principles of the NRA. Everybody had the right, including African Americans. So in those days, there was nobody asserting the Second Amendment more vigorously than those who were supporting Black Americans' rights to have guns. And with regard to the comment again that there was no fraud anywhere in the country, that simply wasn't true. Can I yield to my friend from Arizona to indicate that? Okay.
So I thank the gentleman for yielding. So the rhetoric that constantly says that those who considered that there was election problems lost 60 cases. In Arizona, they won multiple cases dealing with this issue. I'd encourage the gentleman from Maryland to take a look, because there were some victorious cases there. The next point I would make is when we talk about the necessity for this particular provision offered in the amendment by Mr. Fitzgerald, Mr. Tiffany has correctly put out that this has been the expansiveness of government intrusion in virtually every area of your life, and the fact that we have an Attorney General that is encouraging all attorneys general to put the damper on free speech at school board meetings, including a report that came in that the Fairfax County mom who attended a Fairfax County School Board confirmed that the Attorney General sent feds and a helicopter to intimidate parents at that school board meeting. It leads one to understand that an ex parte proceeding where the due process takes place after the loss of rights and the effective punishment, because that's what it really is no due process at all. There is a rationale here for this particular amendment, and that is to protect people who are exercising legitimate free speech rights at school board meetings. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you. And just quickly, this memo or letter from the U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney District of Montana, points out the state of Montana has similar criminal laws against threatening, committing acts of violence, and it may be more appropriate that investigation, prosecution under those statutes. Well, that's exactly why we don't need the federal government rushing into local law enforcement issues, so that, say, someone in a position of power uses that power in order to flex the muscle so that his son-in-law can make vast amounts of money. You have a Fed that can come in and investigate and see if there's corruption there that needs to be dealt with legally. But when it's the feds that are engaging in potential corruption, then who gets to investigate them? I yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Colorado.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding, and I wanted to address a point made by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, let's just be absolutely clear. Not a single gun was found in the United States Capitol on January 6th. Not a single gun was brandished in the United States by the rioters, by the people entering the Capitol. Obviously, the police had guns. But you suggest that there's some nexus between the Second Amendment and January 6th. There is no nexus. There was not an armed... No, I'm not going to yield. There was not an armed insurrection, and I appreciate you pointing out the Heller case and the individual right.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
I yield back.
For what purpose does Ms. Sparks seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I was listening to this discussion, and I grew up in totalitarian country where individuals didn't have rights, law-abiding individuals didn't have rights and didn't have rights to own guns. And that is actually the first thing that totalitarian country under Stalin did, to take people from law-abiding citizens to guns. So only two groups of people had guns. It was the police and bandits. And the Soviet government used police, and if they couldn't to suppress people, then they used bandits on people. And that is what suppression is. So this right empowers as an individual, and it's a very important right. And this is a very important discussion to have. If we talk about, red flag laws, Indiana had them since 2005, and I'm not going to point out how bad provisions of this law I think my colleagues did. We put with due processes, with proper processes, the laws, not really overreaching as this bill, not really federalizing. But unfortunately, it would be that easy. We could prevent, crimes, but laws do not prevent crimes. We had, school shootings. We had just recently at FedEx facility shootings. So it's not going to stop, unfortunately, bad people that are going to try to do bad things. But if we're going to have a legitimate cases, we're going to help people, we have to respect constitutional right, and this bill doesn't do it. But talking about violence, if we're going to talk about violence, Indianapolis has some of the highest crime rates in the country. So definitely doesn't have with violence. But if we're going to talk about violence and anarchy, why don't we talk about what's happening in our border? Drug trafficking, human trafficking, and lawlessness and anarchy on this border, which increases violence in a lot of cities. Why are we talking about not defunding the police and vaccine mandates on policemen that a lot of people now live in the police force? That is increased violence in the cities. Why are we talking about only a third of our children, and can read and write by grade 10, and a lot of cities and urban communities, only tenths of children can do that? That has created a lot of problems and violence. Why don't we talk about issues that really create violence and why we have this increase in violence, not trying to take rights from law-abiding citizens and suppress? Because unfortunately, our government, now FBI using warrantless surveillance, Department of Justice intimidate parents at school board meetings. We have IRS going to be collected information on people. We're becoming like a surveillance state, like a totalitarian regime. And that breaks my heart to see that. So I think we need to have a serious discussion about what we can do to reduce violence. And a lot of them actually happen in the Democrat-run cities, but we need to help them. And I represent one of the cities. I want to be helpful, but let's have serious discussion and protect rights, constitutional rights of individuals, and write these laws that don't infringe on our rights, because this is the only difference between our country and any other country in the world. That's why people want to come here. We're the greatest country in the world because people have the most freedom protected by our Constitution. And the only function we legislators have, that people give us right to be here, to protect their rights to life, liberty, and property. That is the only reason. People give us the right to be here. And we have to think, how do we protect their rights? Don't infringe on their constitutional rights. And it's an extremely important discussion to have. But unfortunately, we cannot have this discussion right now because no one wants to have a serious discussion. We have a lot of drama, but this is a pure infringement. And the way how this bill is written, it's infringement on people's rights. And we cannot be the government of suppression. We have to be the government of liberties and freedoms. And I hope my colleagues can work on some of this issue, how we can make sure that our future generation can experience this great country as our previous generations. And I yield back. Yeah, I yield.
When the gentle lady said that in the totalitarian country she left, the only people who had guns were bandits and government, reminded me of the saying that the police can be there in minutes when seconds count. But if you look at the Democratic-controlled cities that have defunded the police, it's now hours before the police are there. I think it's ironic that in those democratically controlled cities and states, officials have released dangerous criminals back onto our streets. They've refused to prosecute crimes. They've reduced police forces. They've refused to deport criminal illegal aliens, instead releasing them back into our neighborhoods. And while doing all of this, at the same time, they seek to make it harder and riskier for law-abiding citizens to maintain the means of protecting themselves. I find that ironic, curious, and disturbing. And I thank the gentlelady for you.
The time of the gentleman, whoever had of the gentleman, has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Benz seek recognition?
Let's strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And of course, the failure of the bill is it's trampling on due process. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Roy.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. My name has been invoked a few times here. I would point out that, too, the criticism alleged that that there being any Supreme Court precedent or support of any kind for the premise that people have a right to defend against tyranny, I would just submit the Declaration of Independence itself. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Now, we could sit here and go on, and I'm sure Professor Raskin would enjoy doing that, and I would enjoy having that conversation, and happy to have that conversation with you over a beer about what that means, and what that means in 2021. But what it certainly means is that all power comes from the consent of the governed. And what we're doing here is dangerously upending that in this country. That's the truth. The truth is we're turning our institutions on their head. We are eliminating the confidence of the American people in our institutions. Whether it's Dr. Fauci not wanting to acknowledge what's going on with gain of function, whether it's the CDC not wanting to acknowledge natural immunity, whether it's the FDA blocking access to new drugs and Merck and the HHS cutting off access to monoclonal antibodies in Texas, whether it's the Attorney General of the United States targeting parents and focusing on trying to go after parents in school board meetings and refusing to back away from that, even when the National Association of School Boards backs away from their own memo that served as the basis for it. Whether it's a Secretary of Homeland Security or a President of the United States who is literally refusing to willfully execute the laws of the United States on our southern border, specifically refusing to execute Title 42, Migrant Protection Protocol, do whatever it takes under the law to secure the border, to protect the citizens, and fully abandoning that. We are upending our entire order and creating a situation where you have the governor of Texas having to say he, as governor, is going to have to figure out how to defend the border of Texas. And no doubt my learned colleague from Maryland would question whether he has the authority under the Supreme Court's Arizona decision to enforce federal law when the federal government is actually abandoning its duty under the law to secure the border of the United States. But that's what's happening. It's directly what's happening. And not one of my colleagues has been able to refute that once in any of the conversations we had about that. Not once. When we've got tens of thousands of people pouring across the border, 70,000 who have been paroled or been sent out with notices to appear. And my colleagues are shaking their hand, but they can't refute it. It's literally irrefutable because of what we're seeing happen at the border. And when my colleagues talk about, oh, well, with respect to tyranny, whether or not the Second Amendment is to be used to push back on tyranny, that takes forms in a lot of different shapes. It doesn't create a right of revolution against tyranny, but what it does is empower individuals, as my colleague just explained. How about in the summer of 1965, when 20 black Army veterans in Jonesboro, Louisiana, founded an armed community defense patrol, the Deacons for Defense of Justice, inspired by a visible public presence of boldly armed men. Black attitudes in Jonesboro began to change. Black housekeepers stopped accepting racial taunts and quit if the taunts continued. The Deacons' model spread to other Klan heartlands. In June 1966, after the attempted murder of civil rights leader James Meredith, major civil rights organizations banded together to continue the Meredith March Against Fear. As the Deacons' example demonstrates, resistance to tyranny does not have to rise to the level of state militias attempting to oust the national dictator. But what it does is it says that the people are sovereign. The people are those from whom all power emanates. And that is what my friend from Maryland knows. And he knows that. And he wants, I'm going to finish, my name has been invoked a number of times. I'm going to finish my time just to say, at the end of the day, these are important questions that we must and should wrestle with. The rule of law governs. And anybody who takes on and attacks an institution or attacks a member of law enforcement should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But at the end of the day, if the people are going to be sovereign, the Second Amendment is the strongest barrier and protection of their ability to
Time of the
maintain
gentleman
that.
has expired.
I yield back.
For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might be confused, but I am pretty sure we were supposed to be talking about that which would reflect anything that has to do with the worthy legislation that we are marking up today by the gentlewoman, Ms. McBath. I find this conversation incredibly, shamefully a set of talking points that has literally nothing to do with this worthy legislation. Legislation that will save lives and not interfere with constitutional rights. Legislation that was crafted thoughtfully, educated, in a way that is constitutional and protects constitutional rights, but would literally save lives. I find it astonishing that folks on the other side of the aisle are using this to spew misinformation, disinformation that is not germane to the bill whatsoever. I am not sure what school board decisions, as I read from this amendment, have anything to do with the red flag laws that we are trying to pass that would simply save lives. Families need this tool. It is shocking to me. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentlelady, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I guess I'm always defensive on the great work of the Judiciary Committee under Chairman Nadler, and privileged to be the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, and the great work that has come under the subcommittee as it relates to criminal justice reform, which really stuns me. My good friend from Texas, I'm certainly stunned by your access to Google facts and the historic facts that you seem to be offering. But let me be very clear and concise. I'm not a professor yet, Professor Raskin, but I do want to distinguish in what I believe your argument was, is that what we saw on January 6th was tyranny, distinguishable from First Amendment rights. I don't think any of us have ever stopped the expression of discourse, dissent in this nation. I would surmise that there are a number of us in this room that have been on more than one picket line in our lifetime and expressed dissent. This amendment is by its very existence unnecessary, because the First Amendment is constitutional and all of us are able to adhere to it if it is violated. We are talking about the red flag laws. I'm not sure what the gentleman said. I heard something about black people, and I'm always wanting to make sure that we're all part of the human family, the beloved community, but I certainly don't want us to be juxtaposed against undermining red flag laws. Because if there are ever individuals that have been victims of gun violence, it ranges in the people of color. And therefore, our families need help as others do. The simple underpinnings of this legislation has nothing to do with the First Amendment. It has really nothing to do with the Second Amendment, because you are constantly using the term sovereign. I know what that means. You are constantly surmising that the nation will rise up against you. And a letter from an Attorney General is not the nation rising up against you. It is a simple process to bring order to the process of school boards, teachers, family members, and others coming before the board for their children. And the underpinnings of this sovereign terminology is that we're at war with our nation. And that was the premise of January 6th. You were at war. They were at war with the political body, the United States Congress, members of Congress doing their duly elected responsibilities. And in that instance, are you suggesting that they, in their violent dissent, had the right to beat up police officers and put them in hospitals? Because that's what it seems like the argument is. Again, it is a distraction from what we're discussing now, which is to help families, to help human beings, to help Mr. Cruz, the Parkland shooter, who, if we had only exercised those red flag laws that may not have been in place at the time. So I would ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment and to recognize that the underlying bill is simply what it is, to save lives, not a discussion of sovereign
Time of the
powers,
gentlelady has
but to
expired.
save lives. I yield back.
For what purpose does
I yield
Mr.
back to the gentlelady for her kindness.
Her time expired. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think here at the end, I'm not sure how many more have an opportunity to speak or time to speak left, but I think since the question's been posed so often about how far we've strayed from the purpose of this bill, let me go back to how simple this amendment is. The bill is about when a federal court can strip citizens of their Second Amendment rights, take their firearms from them. And the bill lists several factors that the court may consider. All that this simple 3 1/4 line text addition would do is to say that the court, quote, may not consider activities protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution, including parents voicing concerns about school board decisions. Not exclusively that, including that the court may not consider someone exercising their First Amendment rights as predicate to strip gun rights from them. Now, If that's unnecessary in the minds of some, it certainly is harmless to the bill. And yet the fight has raged. And watch, behold, every Democrat will vote against that expression of protection of the First Amendment rights of the citizens. One member just said it was shameful to talk about this when this is so imperative that we pass this bill stripping Second Amendment rights. It's shameful to talk about. Let me tell you something. The National Association of School Boards found shame after they sent a letter maligning and defaming parents across the country for exercising First Amendment rights, defaming them as domestic terrorists. They understood what shame was when someone took control there, and they apologized. What did the Attorney General do today? He doubled down. What is the majority on this committee doing? Doubling down. Moms and dads across the country, look at this carefully. Watch what is happening, because they're going to vote right now to defeat an amendment that merely says a court will disregard your expressions of your First Amendment rights when it is deciding whether it will take your guns away. And with that, I look for any of you who might want time. Seeing none, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
In that case, the question occurs on the amendment. For what purpose does Ms. Deming seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are explaining that they did not mean that it was okay to kill members of law enforcement or members of the military, I think we have a much greater problem than this legislation. So I'm going to not be tempted to engage in such a ridiculous, meaningless conversation that I'm hearing from the other side of the aisle. I'm going to yield to the gentleman, Mr. Cicilline.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I just want to make a very brief point. I think we owe it to the victims of gun violence, people whose families have been just destroyed because someone exhibited dangerous behavior and their family member would be alive today if a red flag law were in place. That's what this legislation is designed to address. We owe them the respect, the victims of gun violence, to debate this bill on the merits. This has been like a Fox News bingo form. Election fraud, Dr. Fauci, border activity, defunding the police, socialism, trans bathrooms, and parents at school board meetings. Bingo! You hit it was a potpourri of every crazy talking point. Let's get back to this bill. Let's show the sponsor the respect that the victims of gun violence deserve in this country. Either support it or oppose it on the merits. Stop talking about all this nonsense and focus on the legislation. I yield back to Ms. Demings and thank her for the time.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Cicilline. Mr. Raskin, I will yield to you if you would like the time.
Well, thanks to the gentle lady. I would just echo my colleague in saying we have seen nothing but a succession of distractions and diversions from a very serious legislation that our colleague from Florida has brought forward. This is working in 19 states. It's working in the District of Columbia. There are a lot of people who have engaged in gun violence who have given a tip-off to the people around them, to members of their family, and this simply extends this policy to say that those people can go to court to demonstrate, if they can show with probable cause, that the person is a danger to themselves or to someone else. And yet, inevitably, it has become an occasion for a series of Fox News talking points. Yeah, I'm just sorry that the legislative process has been degraded in this way, and I yield back to you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the gentleman from Wisconsin for offering what I think is really a common sense amendment that everybody ought to support, although I know none of my Democratic colleagues will do that. But, what it essentially says is that you can't take away somebody's Second Amendment right for merely exercising their First Amendment right. And in this case, of course, it's exercising that First Amendment right at the school board meeting. Now, it might seem ludicrous that anybody would try to take away somebody's First Amendment right at a school board meeting, and I would have initially thought that was the case, but we saw just last week that that's exactly what the National School Board Association was trying to do, and the Biden administration was essentially going along with it. And we want parents, as a former school teacher, and I mentioned this last week at the hearing, as a former school teacher, I know from experience that children do best when their parents are involved in their education. So we want those parents involved. We don't want to prosecute them. We don't want them to be held responsible or liable for merely speaking out on an issue that they care about their kids' education. And the logical place oftentimes to do that is at a school board meeting. That's been happening for years across this country. But when you have controversial subjects like critical race theory, and in some cases it's the matter that's in books, some parents care a great deal about that. They have a right, every right, to speak up at those board meetings. They have no right, of course, to be violent. And if they're violent, local law enforcement can handle that. We don't need the federal government. We don't need the FBI. We don't need the Justice Department using, for example, the Patriot Act to go after those parents and to try to cut off their First Amendment rights by essentially declaring them domestic terrorists. And some of my Democratic colleagues laugh at that, and to some degree, the Attorney General last week denied it. But that's exactly what was happening, and we all know it. So in this case, I think Mr. Fitzgerald is exactly right to make it very clear that you're not going to take away somebody's Second Amendment rights, which to a lot of people are very important. Some not so much, but for most of us, yes, Second Amendment rights, it's in the Constitution, very important. We ought not to jeopardize their Second Amendment rights for merely exercising their First Amendment rights, in this case, at a school board meeting. So I commend the gentleman for offering this amendment. I would urge my colleagues to support it. And
The gentleman yield? Gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to, again, we've heard from the Democrats, this is frivolous, it's a distraction, it's a diversion. This goes to the heart of the issue because it's about liberty, it's about basic constitutional rights. I just want to read, I asked earlier to have this entered into the record, but I want to read from the Ohio School Boards Association letter to the National School Boards Association. Second sentence, the Ohio School Board Association will not continue its membership in the National School Boards Association. Next paragraph, OSBA, Ohio School Boards Association, decision to terminate membership and affiliation with the National School Boards Association is a direct result of the letter sent by the NSBA, the national boards, to President Joe Biden late last month. The letter reported to be sent on behalf of state associations and school board members across the nation. Next sentence is important. This assertion could not be further from the truth. In other words, this group here in Washington acted on their own. This assertion could not be further from the truth. The Ohio School Boards Association was not notified of the letter, nor were we asked for our thoughts on the matter. If we had been consulted, we would have strongly disagreed with the NSBA's decision to request federal intervention as well as your claims of domestic terrorism. That's as strong as it gets. This is a group acting on their own for politics, and the Attorney General is going to implement exactly what they said. And all this amendment says is, as the two previous speakers on our side said, if they're willing to go after your First Amendment liberties, now they're going to go after your Second. We better be aware of all this. That's all this amendment does. I hope we vote yes. I yield back.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, defending the First Amendment and the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution are not distractions. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there anyone desiring time? If not, the question Question, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. All those opposed, no.
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 Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, could I get the yeas and nays on that, please?
A recorded vote, the yeas and nays are requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries?
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Dimmings?
No. Jayapal votes no.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Dimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Isa?
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany?
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Aye. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz?
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Nadler, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no.
Oh, this is
Mr.
Bass. How am I
Ms.
recorded?
Bass?
How am I recorded?
Ms. Bass, you are not recorded.
Bass votes up. No.
Ms. Bass votes no.
Mr. Jones?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jones, you are not recorded.
I am a no.
Mr. Jones votes no.
Anybody else? Is there any other member who wishes to be recorded who hasn't been recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in nature?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition? Without objection. For what purpose does Mr. Stube seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377, offered by Mr. Stube of Florida, page 18,
Without
line
objection, the
25.
amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would provide an award of attorney's fees for the defense of false or frivolous petitions. When I was in the legislature in Florida, I opposed the state's red flag bill, but it was passed and signed into law. As a result, my state has seen the many ways these laws fail to achieve their goals and violate the Second Amendment rights. My amendment today addresses just some of these failures. And I've spoken to many attorneys who practice in Florida where this has become a significant issue and a significant cost to those who have wrongly had their firearms taken away. Red flag laws like the one before us lack due process and procedural protections. In the states, there have been rampant violations of Second Amendment rights due to this lack of basic legal protections. In Florida alone, gun owners with similar names have been mixed up and the wrong person has lost their firearms. Gun owners subject to red flag petitions have been given incorrect information about their administrative hearing location. More concerning, quarreling partners and family members have weaponized red flag laws in domestic disputes. On top of that, studies show these laws do little or nothing to reduce violence. A study by the Crime Prevention Research Center found that red flag laws had no significant impact on murder, suicide, the number of people killed in mass public shootings, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary. I'd also ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record, do red flag laws save lives or reduce crime? By John Lott and Carlisle Moody. Additionally,
Without objection.
Thank you. Additionally, there are already mental health statutes on the books, especially in Florida, like the Baker Act, that better address potentially dangerous individuals while also providing appropriate procedural protections. My amendment should be common sense for all of my colleagues, whether they support or oppose the underlying bill. It simply allows for an attorney's fee award in response to a false or frivolous petition. The underlying bill drags average American gun owners into court to defend their constitutional rights against government infringement, and it does so without paid access to counsel at the proceedings. Additionally, while this bill does create penalties for anyone who files false or frivolous petitions, I remain doubtful that left-leaning law enforcement agencies like our current DOJ would ever apply these penalties and prosecute anyone. My amendment would provide an avenue for some gun owners to get reimbursed for the cost of counsel at sham red flag hearings. Some of the attorneys that I've spoken to in Florida that have handled these cases have said that it costs upwards to about $10,000 in attorney's fees for petitioners to get their guns back. If an agency takes and confiscates a firearm wrongly, the individual has to then petition the court because a lot of these law enforcement agencies are not willing to give back firearms without a court order. My amendment would provide an avenue for some gun owners to get reimbursed for the cost of counsel at sham red flag hearings. Additionally, my amendment would provide a way for the victims of false and frivolous petitions to sanction those who filed the petition, even if authorities decline to pursue criminal charges. This is not all that different from Rule 11 in federal civil procedure or similar rules under every state's civil procedures. It should be non-controversial and common sense. This amendment does not fix all of the problems with the underlying bill, but it helps fix some of the glaring failures with this dangerous and unconstitutional piece of legislation, and that is the amendment, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. If you will look at page 18 of the bill, it reads as follows. Penalty for false reporting or frivolous petitions: an individual who knowingly submits materially false information to the court in a petition for a federal extremist protection order under this section, or who knowingly files such a petition that is frivolous, unreasonable, or without foundation, shall be fined not more than $5,000 or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both. So this amendment is both unnecessary, since there is a very considerable criminal penalty for anyone who does this, and attorney fees, well, I'll leave it at that. It is unnecessary because to assess reasonable attorney fees. By the way, someone who is sued under this and needs an attorney will have an attorney assigned to them by the court at this point anyway. So I oppose this amendment as completely unnecessary. I yield back. For what purposes?
I withdraw my point of order.
Point of order was withdrawn. I yielded back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. The problem with the logic of the chair is that while this has a deterrent facility in it by criminalizing or providing a penalty for someone who raises a frivolous or false claim, it doesn't restore the victim in this instance. And the victim would be the one who is the victim of the fraudulent or false claim. That's why Mr. Stubbe's amendment is so virtuous and so necessary, because it says, all right, if you're going to pass a red flag, how about letting the victim, who has to spend $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever it may be, who knows, who can estimate? They may have to bring in psychiatrists, other legal experts to come in and testify, medical experts. It's going to cost a lot of money. And this would allow them to recover if there is truly a false or fraudulent or frivolous claim. Thus, I support this rather common sense restitution to victim amendment that Mr. Stubbe is offered, and I'll yield time to Mr. Gates of Florida.
Yeah, I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I would suggest that my colleague from Florida could be even more ambitious by suggesting treble fees in damages. If we really want to deter the frivolous claims, this seems like the most modest and reasonable way to do so, tracing Rule 11. And that's why it makes sense and would conform to other laws under this posture. I yield back to the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. Now yield to the other gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, the gentleman, for yielding. So the way that, I can't speak to how other states work, but in response to the chairman's contention that the bill deals with this issue, it absolutely does not deal with this issue. Here is how this plays out in real world, in real life, and has played out in Florida. A law enforcement officer gets a call in a domestic situation from a spouse or an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever the case may be, and that law enforcement officer makes a decision based on the red flag laws in Florida to confiscate an individual's guns. Later, it's determined that that individual's guns shouldn't have been confiscated. There's actually some instances that I briefly touched on and could give a lot of different examples of people with similar names who have had their guns stolen because the police went to the wrong place because the names were the same. What then has to happen once the firearms are in the possession of the law enforcement agency is the individual has to hire a lawyer to petition the court in that jurisdiction to get an order from the court demanding that the law enforcement agency give back the firearm. If the individual who wrongly had their firearms taken from a sheriff's department goes to that sheriff's department and said, you wrongly took my guns, there was no charges criminally filed against me for a violation of the crime, that law enforcement agency is not going to give those guns back without a court order. So that individual has to then hire a lawyer to petition the court to get a court order to then order that law enforcement agency to return that firearm that was taken without a warrant, without sometimes in this case, without due process, and sometimes without probable cause because you're asking a law enforcement officer to just make a determination. So what this amendment simply does is says if there's a circumstance that happens like this, is we're going to allow for a reasonable attorney's fees provision for that individual to be able to to pay his lawyers to get his firearms back. And this disproportionately affects low-income and middle-income individuals who don't have $10,000 to be able to spend and pay for a lawyer to get their guns back. So especially in your high-crime, low-income areas, disproportionately disadvantaging those individuals because they don't have a $2,500 retainer to pay a lawyer to then represent them, to petition the court, to get an order from that court to get their firearms back. So what happens in those circumstances is those individuals who wrongly had their firearms stolen or taken by law enforcement without a warrant, without due process, then have no financial ability to go back and get their firearms back. This amendment would simply allow that if that circumstance have occurred, and it has occurred in the state of Florida, that individual would have reasonable attorney fees paid for by the agency that wrongly took his firearms, so they don't have to hire an attorney to do that. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. Now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
I thank the gentleman, and I suppose it is in order to observe that the circumstances the gentleman from Florida just described would make this bill as proposed systemically racist. It seeks to impose disproportionate burden on those.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I would strike the last word and
Gentleman is recognized.
yield time to my good friend from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Disproportionately burdens those who are least able to bear the burden. And it is telling, isn't it, in the context of this bill, which over the course of all of the other debate, what has recurred as a theme over and over is the degree to which it disregards the interest of the person whom the Constitution vests with a fundamental right. Excuse me, let me make sure I say that right. The Constitution protects an existing fundamental right. And over, that is disregarded. So when the chairman says he opposes the amendment because this is fully provided for, unnecessary, because prison time or a fine will inure to the benefit of the state. The state is fully protected, but the individual is out of luck again. What do you know? I yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Reclaiming my time. The other thing I just offer some perspective on is that not only are the costs associated with this, as Mr. Stubbe has laid out, I think very well, but in Wisconsin, I went through this in the 90s, and it was related to any domestic abuse cases where it was in statute that it basically said those firearms must be turned over. And I think a lot of members, when they think about this situation, they're thinking about one firearm. They might be thinking about a pistol or a revolver that individual has. But I know in my district, in the 5th Congressional, in Wisconsin, and throughout the state, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that there are many people, constituents of mine, who are sportsmen, who also do target shooting, who use firearms in a number of different ways. They may have 100 firearms in a safe, locked up securely in their home. Now, there has to be some place to move those firearms for a temporary amount of time, as the statute would prescribe. And I know what happened in Wisconsin. Many of the sheriffs, they didn't want to touch them. They didn't want their hands on these individual guns and rifles because they would have to accept the liability for the care of those and the storage of those. If you think about that, what's a sheriff going to do with those individual firearms? What's a chief of police going to do with them? So what happened was the judge started to order that they be turned to another family member. And it created chaos. It created a mess. So my point is, I think there's a lot of long range and other ancillary items associated with this that I don't know that it's really been thought through. And it's another reason I think to support this and any other amendments that would modify what I think is obviously an extreme overreach. And I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Dimmings? Ms. Dimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush?
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Buck?
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany?
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey?
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach?
Am I recorded?
Yes.
Ms.
Mr. Chairman,
Fishbach votes yes.
how am I recorded?
Ms. Sparts?
Members should wait till the end of the roll call to ask how they recorded.
Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz?
Mr. Benz votes yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Owens, aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries?
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries
Deutsch?
votes no.
Mr. Deutsch?
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
I think that's
Mr.
Steve
Cohen? Mr.
Mr.
Issa?
Chairman, how am I recorded?
I want to vote, this is on the amendment, I vote no.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Issa?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, please.
Mr. Issa votes yes.
Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones is a no.
Mr. Jones votes no.
Are we ready for that? Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? The clerk will report. Does Ms. Ross seek recognition to be recorded?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Ross, you are not recorded.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no.
You got everybody? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Massey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the
I
desk.
reserve a point of order,
The
Mr.
clerk
Chairman.
will report the amendment, and the point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377, offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky, page 24, line 6.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment. It's just common sense, I believe. The underlying bill itself has an annual reporting requirement to report on the number of red flag orders or extreme risk protection orders by race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, gender, age, disability, and English language proficiency. I presume this report is required in the bill to make sure that there are not racial disparities in the right to bear arms as a consequence of these red flag laws. And it's right to include these reports in the underlying bill. And so therefore, it would also be correct and advisable to have this same report issued by the Attorney General on the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So what my amendment does is it says, in addition to issuing this annual report on the various effects across race, ethnicity, sex, age, disability, in addition to doing that for the red flag laws, that we should do that for the NICS, the National Instant Background Check System, to make sure that we don't have racial disparities there. Now, we already actually know there are racial disparities there. The data that we have shows that African-American males are 3 times more likely to be denied the purchase of a firearm at the first point of the check, and falsely, in fact. And the same, and Hispanic males are twice as likely with respect to Caucasian males to be falsely denied in the NICS instant background check system. So we need to get these numbers. We need to figure out how this is happening and how to keep it from happening. And I'm afraid it's probably going to happen in the red flag laws. So it's right that the underlying bill has this report in the red flag laws, but we also need to have the same report in the NICS report. There's one other thing that my amendment does. The categories that are listed for red flag laws in the report include race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, gender, age, disability, and English language proficiency. But I think it should also include average annual income. As Mr. Stubbe wisely pointed out, and that his amendment sought to fix, these things, every one of these laws has a disparate effect and impact on low-income individuals, regardless of race or ethnicity or sex. The threshold that is required, you have to upfront the money, you have to try to take time away from work, even if there was no money involved and no lawyers involved and no filing fees. Just the time away from work is an opportunity cost that many low-income individuals cannot afford. So I think we should also include average annual income as a category in these reports, both for red flag laws and for the NICS report. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman?
Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I do insist on my point of order. The report requested is not germane. It is dealing with the NICS on a very broad question of a myriad of demographic factors. I do appreciate the gentleman's concern about race, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to discuss other race-based discrimination. But in the instance of this legislation, this is about red flag laws. It is not about the extensive report under NICS, and so I insist on my point of order, Mr. Chairman.
I agree with the point of order. I will point. The NICS report is beyond the scope of the bill, and therefore is out of order. The first two amendments, however, the first two parts of the amendment, however, inserting average annual income, are in order, and I would accept them if the gentleman. I would accept them as amendments if the gentleman would agree to separate.
I will agree to withdraw this amendment and substitute another amendment that should also be at the desk, which includes the two provisions that the chairman has agreed to include, which would insert average annual income as a reporting category.
Would it do anything else? All right.
I would like.
Fine. The amendment is withdrawn. The clerk will report the next amendment. Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 2377, offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky, page 24, line 6. Insert after disability the following: average annual income.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
This amendment is very simple. Look, the underlying bill includes reports based on race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, gender, age, disability, average annual, English language proficiency. This would add average annual income as a reporting category. And that is necessary, just like the other categories are necessary. We know in the NICS background check system.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield to the chairman.
We will accept this amendment. We have no reason to oppose it. We will accept this amendment.
I withdraw my point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn.
Chairman, if you.
Point of order is withdrawn, and we accept the amendment.
Well, they say when you have the sell, quit selling, but I'd like to keep selling if I may.
Gentleman has the floor.
All right, reclaiming my time. I think this is an important category to include, and I appreciate the chairman recognizing that. The reason these reports are important, and the reason that I think we also need these reports for the instant background check system, is we do know there is racial disparity in the application of this law. It's not intended, but there are things that could be done to prevent the racial disparity, like in the instant background check system. We could use something other than similar spelling of names and similar birthdays to check. And all of these laws have underlying implications. The ramifications are that they are racially disparate in the outcomes. They are going to be disparate also in the outcomes for income. And these are some of the most regressive laws that we can put on the books. It's especially concerning because this is a fundamental constitutional right as ruled by the Supreme Court and is laid out by founding fathers. And your income should have no effect on your ability to keep and bear arms. When we see fees charged, for instance, to get a concealed carry permit, if you have a state that has a fee that's $100 or more, we see that concealed carry permits are issued far less frequently, not to the people who can afford it, but to the people who can't afford it. So income disparity is a very important category, and I'm glad that the chairman recognizes the importance of reporting this, and I hope that what they will find out, of course, I hope this bill does not pass, I'm going to vote against it, but I hope what we find out from these reports will tell us that these laws have a racial and income disparity in terms of their application, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I hope we can go to a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and I hope no one will call a roll call vote. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Mr. Stube seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlemen, the clerk will report the amendment.
Reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377, offered by Mr. Stube of Florida. Page 6, line 17.
Without objection, the
I reserve a
amendment is
point of order.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under this bill, without even alleging any criminal activity, someone can have an individual's firearms and ammunition confiscated. The current evidentiary standard to obtain an ex parte order in this bill is probable cause. Probable cause is an unbelievably low standard to deprive an individual of his or her constitutional rights without an allegation of criminal activity or an opportunity to be heard. This amendment would raise every evidentiary standard from probable cause and clear and convincing to beyond a reasonable doubt. If we're going to deprive an individual of their constitutional rights without an allegation of criminal activity or an opportunity to be heard, then the highest evidentiary standard should be applied in this bill. That is the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I will, does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do not.
The gentleman does not insist on his point of order. The point of order is withdrawn. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The amendment, the standard in the amendment of imminent.
Standard in the bill. Standard in the amendment.
In the bill. Standard in the bill. I believe the existing standards in the bill are adequate, and we do not need to add these standards and the content of this amendment and make the bill more complicated. The existing standards in the bill are quite adequate to the task, and I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Issa seek recognition?
Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I just came back from Foreign Affairs Committee, and I felt obligated to update the chairman. For whatever reason, the interpretation of the attending physician not only is not the same in the U.S. Senate, where on the floor they're not wearing masks, but I was in Foreign Affairs. None of the witnesses, sitting almost in identical positions to the three staff here, wore masks during the entire hearing. I might suggest strongly that we again go back to the attending physician for an opinion, because there doesn't seem to be uniformity between the House and the Senate or from committee to committee. And the reluctance of members to come to this committee because of the mask rule seems to work to the detriment of the speed and congeniality, if you will, that we would hope for here.
The gentleman yield?
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
We will be happy to consult the attending physician again. I wasn't aware of the disparity of the difference with the Senate. We'll be happy to consult with the attending physician again, but meanwhile, it's incumbent on everyone in this committee, unless they want to appear virtually, but everyone in this committee who's here to wear masks. And as I said, I will not recognize anyone who doesn't. And I see one person not wearing a mask. You should put it on.
Well, but you know, you can't recognize me with it on very well, but
No,
it's
but
me.
Mr. Stubbe's not wearing his mask, and if he seeks recognition.
Perhaps he's going to talk. But reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I know that the work we're doing here is important, but I strongly would recommend that we look at, for example, last night, and I know I'm taking time of the committee, but last night I was at a dinner with virtually, I don't know, 3/4 of the members of the Senate and a large group of members of the House, most of the Foreign Affairs Committee members, and the Japanese ambassador, and a host of other people from the administration. And we all sat around the dinner table, as close as Mr. Gomer and I are, without masks. They did require that we have a test, and they did require that we be vaccinated or have a current test. The reality is there are procedures that would allow members to be close together to do these things. And although I haven't been in your ante room, I would suggest that you would find in most of the ante rooms the masks come off when they leave. So rather than continuing to do this, I would hope that we would reach out to the attending physician, and at a minimum ask if we could be treated as senators.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
I've already said we will reach out to the attending physician. End of story.
I know, but taking yes for an answer, you know, I've got another minute and 56 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purposes Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Wait a minute, we're still on the Stubbe amendment. If no one else seeks recognition, we'll go to a vote.
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition?
this is Massey from Kentucky.
The gentleman is recognized. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I wish to speak in support of the Stubbe amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I would just note that there are several sheriffs who have already announced their refusal to implement these red flag laws because they are dangerous to their deputies. To go into a situation, and in many cases unannounced, or in most cases unannounced, and in a lot of cases early in the morning, before the person being served or the person whose weapons be taken away is even awake, these law enforcement officers are sent into a very difficult situation. They're going to agitate the individual. They know the individual is armed. And a lot of sheriffs are saying, we're not going to do this. We're not going to enforce your red flag laws because they put our deputies in a dangerous position. And that is why Mr. Stubbe's amendment is so important. Why would you want to endanger somebody's life just on a suspicion? It needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt. There needs to be a high standard before you're going to put the lives of deputies and other law enforcement officers at risk by agitating individuals unannounced who have firearms. And so I would urge those in this committee to vote for the Stubbe amendment. And if he wishes more time to speak on the amendment, I'll yield to him. Otherwise, I will yield back. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? If not,
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much. This bill establishes firm due process protections for respondents. Both the short-term and long-term orders require a high standard of proof. This bill has significant due process protections. In the ex parte proceeding, ex parte orders require a showing of probable cause, and probable cause is a standard that we must use for other meaningful law enforcement actions, such as allowing law enforcement officers to obtain a warrant, allowing them to arrest an individual, and allowing them to search a person or property. But there are also additional protections, and I want to let you know, if you're reading this bill, there must be a signed and sworn affidavit. A judge is involved to make the determination of whether the standards are met. The order must be necessary to prevent that harm, and the risk must be imminent. So once again, there are systems, there are processes that are put in place to protect the system of due process. Please read the bill. Let's not try to add anything else extraneous to it. This is a good piece of legislation that saves lives.
Would the
And I
gentleman,
yield back.
would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I yield to my colleague from Texas.
I want to thank the gentlelady for that very clear and succinct explanation. I want to juxtapose clear and convincing evidence against the unreasonable man standard. This legislation is offered to save lives. It is a tool for family members. It is a tool for people who feel threatened or in danger, people whose life may be at a moment's edge of being lost because some person in desperate need or in desperate need of intervention, desperate need because of intended violence, desperate need because of intended frustration, seeking the only relief they think they can have at the hands of a gun. And the clear and convincing standard is intended to help civilly save lives. That's what red flag laws are. And to insist on a reasonable man standard or beyond a reasonable standard is in fact to take more time to endanger the proposed victim. Again, we started out with the idea that this is to save lives, and it is documented across America that red flag laws save lives, and it is at the hands of guns. It is not to take guns away, it is to save lives. I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I yield back to the gentlelady.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No, no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No, 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 no.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings? Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Steen?
No.
Ms. Steen votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Big ol' aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Isa?
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck?
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube? Mr. Stube votes yes. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop?
Yes.
Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach?
Yes.
Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts?
Ms. Sparts, we cannot hear you. Ms. Sparts, we could not hear you. You might want to.
Can you hear me now? Sparks
Yes.
votes yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz?
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Owens, aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
How am I recorded? This is Bass.
Ms. Bass, you were not recorded.
Bass votes no.
Ms. Bass votes
How am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you were not recorded.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jones, you are not recorded.
Mr. Jones votes no.
Mr. Jones votes no.
Are there any members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purposes Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2377, offered by Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin, page 12, line 4.
Without objection, the amendment.
Is there
will
a
be
point of order,
considered-
Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment, and a point of order is reserved.
Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned with my previous amendment, this bill is an unconstitutional red flag law that infringes on the Second Amendment rights while depriving Americans of due process. I do not believe it is possible to draft a red flag law that will hold up to the constitutional scrutiny if it were to come before the Supreme Court. However, it would be unconscionable to let this bill move forward without protecting our service members. We've already seen the other side baselessly accuse members of the military of holding extremist views. The problem is the other side frequently considers anything they disagree with as extremist. Further, the VA has used a patient flag system to identify difficult or non-compliant patients they classify as threats. Veterans often are not notified that they are on this list and have no recourse to appeal. My amendment would protect veterans against this blatant discrimination by prohibiting military service from being considered as a risk factor under this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, support our veterans, and I yield back.
I recognize myself. First of all, the amendment, the point of order is withdrawn. Point of order is withdrawn. I recognize myself. This is something we would consider going forward. We're not prepared to do this today. We may very well do it before the bill goes to the floor. And if the gentleman will withdraw the amendment, we will work with him on the way to the floor. Now yield to the gentleman.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. I think it's a valid, obviously, I think it's a valid amendment, and it's something that should be considered, and I would certainly entertain that offer and look forward to working with the majority to amend the bill.
So the amendment is withdrawn, and we will work with you going forward. The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, the question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Aye.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Hold a minute.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Hello.
Aye.
Hold on a minute.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
We are hybrid, so I've moved to the virtual.
Mr. Jeffries.
Votes,
Someone should shut their mic.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes
I'm sorry,
no.
Jeffries votes aye.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries
Jeffries
votes
votes
aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
I'll just do that.
Mr. Cicilline votes
So-
aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings. Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Nagoose.
Aye.
Mr. Nagoose votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Oh, that's right.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Gomer votes no.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Isa?
Free of mask, I vote no.
Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck?
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey?
Massey votes no.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop?
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts?
No.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz?
No.
Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
How am I recorded?
Ms.
How am I
Jackson Lee, you are
recorded?
not recorded.
I am, this is on the amendment?
This is on the amendment nature of a substitute.
The bill itself?
The amendment in nature of a substitute, which will be immediately followed by a vote on the bill.
This is, I'm voting aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, this is Corey. How am I recorded, please?
Ms. Bush, you are not recorded.
Thank you. Ms. Bush, yes.
Ms. Bush votes yes.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 19 noes.
The amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 2377 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings. Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia. Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Gomer votes no.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Isa?
No.
Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck?
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stube?
No.
Mr. Stube votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey?
Massey votes no.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop?
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald?
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz?
Mr. Benz votes no.
Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded?
How is Swalwell recorded?
Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 18 noes.
Excuse me,
Wait,
excuse me. How did Sparks Group record it?
Ms. Sparts is not recorded.
is Ms. Sparts seeking recognition? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 18 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. At this time, the committee will stand in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow.